Tonight in our study in the intertestamental period, we come to another of the groups on the last page of our outline. They're not technically a Jewish religious group, neither is the next group. They both are more political groups than they are religious ones, although you find them here on our outline under this heading, Jewish religious sects. They are a Jewish sect, and they certainly have influence in religious areas. I didn't have anywhere else to place them. That's why they're placed right there. But the next one you see after we've looked at, well, the Pharisees have come up, and Jesus has dealt with them a time or two and kind of squashed them. And then the Sadducees came up, and he's kind of done the same with them. The Essenes, they don't pop up in the New Testament, but we looked at them for a couple of messages. And then we see in the fifth place the Herodians. The Herodians. Now they appear two different times in the New Testament. They're found in three places, but one of those is a parallel between two Gospels. But they appear on two different occasions. And we're going to be looking at the Herodians tonight in the first place, and we're going to be looking at these two texts, the only two that we have to discuss them. Matthew 22, verses 16 to 22. Matthew 22, Matthew 21, 22, 23, all those chapters there. Well, it goes back a little earlier, really back to 19. From 19 through 23, Jesus is getting into a lot of discussions with the religious leaders, or on this occasion, some political people around him. He's getting into a lot of discussions with them, and that's where you find a lot of that material in Matthew's Gospel. Not that it's not found earlier, but chapters 21 and 22 particularly are notable in that regard. Verses 16 to 22, and that's paralleled in Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17. That's the same occasion, though. Mark 12, 13 to 17. That's one time where they're found in the Bible. The other time where they're found is in Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 8. Now, we've got two different occasions then when they're found, and they're separated by several years in time. And they're separated in geography as well. That first time in Mark 3, that's the earliest reference to Herodians in the Bible. And here they're seen in Jesus' early ministry, evidently back in the rather early stages of Jesus' public ministry when he was still up in Galilee. And that other occasion, which was really the first one that I gave you in Matthew 22 and Mark 12, that happens in Jerusalem, not up in Galilee where Mark 3 takes place. That happens in Jerusalem, and it happens during the last week that Jesus spends in Jerusalem. So they're really not even related, except you've got the same people, the Herodians, but the incidents are completely separate and distinguished. All three of those passages, whether the two in Mark or the one in Matthew, mention the fact that they join with the Pharisees in their opposition to Jesus. So that will be interesting and significant here later on. Luke and John don't mention them. You have to turn to Matthew and Mark to find them. You don't have them in Luke or in the sequel to Luke, the book of Acts, and you don't have them in John's Gospel. Now, so there are the places where they're seen. Let's come to the name Herodian. What does that mean? Well, unlike maybe some of the obscurity that surrounded the other terms we looked at, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, this one appears to be rather straightforward. Herodians must have something to do with Herod. The others are a little difficult to be real precise on, but this one I don't think will be difficult. The Herodians had something to do with Herod. The word Herodian is of Latin origin, and literally it means partisans of Herod. Partisans. In other words, people on Herod's side. Partisans of Herod. They are also found in extra-biblical sources. The New Testament's not the only place where they pop up. Josephus makes reference to them with two different Greek phrases on at least two occasions, and he refers to them basically as those of Herod's party. Those of Herod's party. This is in Josephus' writings. For instance, he refers to them in his book called Wars, the Wars of the Jews. Book 1, chapter 16, section 6. 1:16:6. And he also refers to them in antiquities of the Jews, in Book 14, Chapter 15, Section 10. But that's really not that important. But I'm just saying that Josephus does make reference to them. Now, in Josephus' writings, both of those places where the Herodians appear, and Josephus calls them, the Herodians, those of Herod's party, both of those places where they appear is back during the time of King Herod the First, or King Herod the Great. He's the Herod of the birth of Jesus in Matthew chapter 2. Well, of course, by the time of Matthew 22, that Herod is dead and gone by many years, by 3 decades now. He's dead and gone. So it couldn't have reference strictly to the same Herod that the Herodians did that Josephus makes reference to. They would refer to the Herod the Great back when Jesus was born. This must be a different Herod. They also appear elsewhere outside these references in the New Testament in Josephus. So they must be some rather important, local, however temporary, because they don't continue on the scene, temporary situation. And by the way, I might have neglected to say something about the Sadducees. You could probably have taken the implication with some other things that I said in talking about whether or not they were a temporary phenomenon in Israel. The Pharisees, as a strict party called the Pharisees, were certainly temporary. But they kind of evolve into the great Jewish rabbis over the next few centuries. The Essenes, we saw what happened with them. They're annihilated. And so they were certainly a temporary situation. The Sadducees were also a very temporary situation. Since to be a Sadducee was to be all caught up in the Jerusalem temple and the liturgy, because the Sadducees were related to the high priest, the chief priest. One was a party, one was a job that you held. Whenever the temple and sacrifice come to an end, then that party would obviously come to an end as well. So really we've said that all of these parties, they were a local, temporary situation. Even the Pharisees didn't really continue as the Pharisees. If we spoke of any of them as continuing in any descendant sense, it would have to be the Pharisees with their evolution into the rabbis. But really none of them, as such, continue any after, let's say, the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And that's true with the Herodians as well, and you'll see why. It's obvious that this would have to be true. So there's something about the places where they're found, their name. Now, who are they? Just who are the Herodians? Well, their origin goes back to several decades BC. Now, not several centuries like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. So here's a big difference now between those earlier 3 groups and this 4th group, the Herodians. They go back several decades BC, whenever Herod the Great was attempting to establish his rule over Palestine. We've got a lot of that on earlier ITP tapes, so I won't go into that again. By the time of Jesus' ministry, of course, Herod the Great is dead, and he has left several sons behind him who have ruled in different places, like Archelaus ruled down in Judea, and he was deposed, and the Roman prefects and procurators took over that, with the most notable one being Pontius Pilate. So that's not important for our study. We don't have Herods there. But another Herod, Herod Antipas, A-N-T-I-P-A-S, that we've studied on a whole tape before. Herod Antipas is also a descendant of Herod the Great, and he is ruling. And he's ruling in Galilee and in Perea, which is beyond Jordan. Galilee and Perea, beyond Jordan, that area east of the Jordan River. So these men, called Herodians, in the first place, several decades BC, had to have something to do with Herod the Great. You could probably guess they're either in favor or opposed, one or the other. Well, being named after him, probably in favor would be the best guess, and that would be the correct guess. They were certainly in favor of Herod and his rule. They're Jewish people. By the time we come to these texts that we're going to be looking at in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, Herod Antipas is the one ruling, so the Herodians are the ones who are in favor of the rule of Herod Antipas. Or we could say in the Herodian dynasty. So let me kind of sum up what I've just said with a sentence or two. I would say that the Herodians were Jewish men. Now Herod had some mixed ancestry, you'll recall, Idumean and Jewish ancestry. These, I think, are Jewish men, the Herodians, of high standing. I don't really know what religious party. The Bible doesn't say what or if, which one, or if they even did belong to some religious party. But they were Jewish men of high standing who were sympathetic with Herodian dynastic rule. They were sympathetic with Herodian dynastic rule. Now, we have to back up a little bit, and I'll say in a little more detail what I just brushed over quickly there. After the banishment, this goes back, I think, to first decade, I guess, A.D., after the banishment of Herod Archelaus. Now, he's the one who's mentioned over in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 22, Matthew 2:22. Archelaus reigns in Judea after the death of his father, Herod the Great. Well, we also have a tape on Herod Archelaus from earlier. He reigns in Judea for a while, but not for very long, for only a couple of years, and he is banished because of some problems that come up in Judea, and what some of the Jews report to Rome and to the emperor about him. Herod Archelaus is banished from Judea to Gaul, over in Spain. And somewhere around AD 6, the Roman government takes over more of a direct rule of Judea. Now, Judea is where Jerusalem is, southern Israel, southern Palestine versus Galilee up to the north, where the Herods are going to continue their dynastic rule for quite some time. No, the Romans take over southern Palestine. Of course, they're in control of the whole nation, the whole world of their day, but they take it over with a more direct rule through the prefects or the procurators. Pontius Pilate was one of those, stationed not at Jerusalem, but up at Caesarea Maritime, or it's often called Caesarea by the Sea, versus Caesarea Philippi, which is inland and not on the coast, up north of the Sea of Galilee. The prefects or the procurators take over, and they rule for Rome. They are Romans. They're not Jews. They are Romans who rule directly in the south. I'm having to tell you this to tell you the background, the difference that we have with these Herodians and the situation that we have up in Galilee. These Jews to the north up in Galilee evidently came to prefer Herodian rule through Herod Antipas versus, direct Roman rule, which is what we're going to have down in the south. Evidently because they felt it gave them a little more freedom or independence. Now, that's pretty much it in a nutshell there. We don't have Herodians down to the south because there's no Herod to support down there. You have Pontius Pilate. He is a Gentile. He is a Latin. He is a Roman. Pontius Pilate. He's not a Jew. The only reason that he's there is the Romans have sent him there, stationed him there as prefect or procurator to govern that area directly for them, and he's responsible directly to the Roman government. But he doesn't really have any contact with the people. Now, Herod Antipas up to the north is different. He has Jewish blood. He's completely unlike Pontius Pilate. He himself also is answerable to the Roman government, but he's not a Roman, and that's the point. He is a Jew. There is at least that aspect of him that the Jewish people in Galilee can identify with. So the Herodians are a group of Jewish people, evidently of high standing, to the north in Galilee. You won't find them down south unless they're traveling down to Jerusalem. And they are very sympathetic with Herod Antipas's rule because they think they have a little more freedom and liberty and independence since they don't have direct Roman rule over them. They are not a religious party or sect. I know I have them that way on the outline because there's nowhere else to put them, Jewish religious sect. But just take off religious, and they are kind of like a sect. They're really not even a political party. They simply have a certain political attitude or outlook. They aren't some official type party who's trying to vote or something like that. They just are a political group of people, Jewish men, politically minded, let's say, who are sympathetic with Herodian rule because they think it gives them a little more independence. Now, I don't know. You could probably argue the pros and cons of whether or not they really have any more independence from Rome than their kinsmen do down in Judea. They probably really don't, but at least it sounds good to have someone over you who's related to you by blood, even though you know he's answerable to the Roman governor. He answers to the Roman government. So really you're not going to have that much more freedom. But this is a political outlook that these Jews have to the north. They seem to want a united nation under less direct Roman rule. And that's going to explain their presence in Jerusalem, as we'll see here later on. We do see them in Jerusalem. It's because they're traveling down there. But I think, and this is a little hypothetic and speculative, but I think probably their notions, the Herodians, their notions are they would rather see the type of rule they have in Galilee extended all over Palestine. They'd rather have the Romans leave. Take the Romans out. Take Pontius Pilate back to Rome. Take those Roman soldiers, those centurions that are always popping up in the Gospels and Acts. Take those men out. Appoint Jewish men over. They'll still have to answer to Rome, but appoint them over all of Palestine, even if you want to keep it divided up with Galilee and Perea and Idumea to the south and Judea and Samaria right in the middle and so forth. Even if you want to have it divided up, appoint Jewish people as the rulers. So that seems to be their desire, their goal, to have more say-so in government and a less direct Roman rule. So with that as our background, let's turn to these passages and see what they have to say about the Herodians. Mark chapter 3 to begin with, since that's the earliest appearance. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 8. Mark 3, 1 to 8. And like we've done with the others, we'll try to make some parallels with what we find today. The Bible's rather complete, even here in the Gospels, even on this subject of all these various Jewish groups. The Bible's rather complete in giving us pictures of the types of people that you find, let's say, in the church, right on down through history. You've got conservatives, you've got liberals, you've got those who see themselves as a remnant, whether they're right in their seeing themselves as a remnant. You've always had groups who saw themselves as a remnant. The Essenes were certainly a remnant group. They saw themselves that way. The Pharisees have their ideas. They're conservative and non-politically minded. The Sadducees are liberals and very politically minded. And you find those very types of expressions of religious and political views right down until this day in the church. And I think you'll see the same thing can be said with the Herodians as well. So, well, anyway, in Mark chapters 1 through 3, we have grouped together a series of conflicts that Jesus has with the Pharisees. It's like those chapters I gave you earlier, 19 through 23 in Matthew. They speak of different times in Jesus' ministry, and they speak in different places. One, Matthew's, is in Jerusalem, and Mark's, the second one, is earlier, and it's up in Galilee anyway. But you have kind of grouped together here, as you open Mark's Gospel, a series of conflicts. Mark goes beyond that to discuss other things, but here in these first few chapters you have healings and teachings and so forth, but they're always in the context of conflicts that Jesus is experiencing with the Pharisees. Now what's new then with Mark 3 concerning the Pharisees, we've looked at the Pharisees. They have a lot of conflicts with Jesus. What's new with the Pharisees is that we are going to see them here joining with the Herodians. We've seen them join with the Sadducees earlier. We're going to see them joining up with the Herodians here. How are we going to explain this? They really have different goals, and they're really different-minded people, although they are all Jews. Well, let's read the passage and see what we have. He entered again into the synagogue. It's the synagogue of Capernaum up in his hometown, not his original hometown, but the one to which he's moved. You see that back in chapter 2. He enters again into the synagogue. He's been there earlier. He's done some healing earlier in chapter 2 and in chapter 1. Both of those chapters you find him in Capernaum. These chapters revolve around Capernaum and its synagogue. And there was a man there which had a withered hand. And they watched him, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day. It's a Sabbath day question, that they might accuse him. And he saith unto the man which had the withered hand, stand forth. Now this is in a synagogue service. He's got a withered hand. Now we've dealt a little bit with this earlier in these studies in ITP, where we seem to keep touching on, because that's what we're studying now, the parallels between that and what we find in religion today. You have to go to church, as we could say, to find a lot of sick people. Either go to church or go to the hospital, one or the other. You'll find places filled with the sick. What's unusual, someone could say, well, what's the big deal about that? Israel's got promises for healing. What's a man with a withered hand doing in there? Waiting for his healing? Well, I doubt it. I doubt he has any faith for it. I doubt he's ever been taught the promises of the Old Testament. He's been given a little Jewish formal indoctrination to some scribal Pharisaic notions is probably what he's been taught. It was scattered with a few faithful readings from the law and the prophets. You always got to do that in church, synagogue here for the Jews. And so Jesus notices this man. Here's a covenant individual. He's a Jew. He's got covenants and promises made to him. So Jesus said, stand forth. In other words, he's sitting down there. He doesn't want something to be done over in a corner and people, could mock it or laugh it off or say, well, where's your proof? Stand up. Let's let everyone see what's going to happen here. It's a gift of faith working, you see. All these gifts of the Spirit are always working in Jesus. When I say always, they're not just happening left and right. They work as the Spirit brings them in His ministry. But gift of faith and working of miracles, I've had those very gifts before, and they just come, and when they manifest themselves, they're there. Gift of faith, there's no doubt. You couldn't doubt if you wanted to doubt. Of course, you don't want to. That's part of the whole point, but you couldn't doubt. It's a gift of faith, supernatural. Gift of faith here. How do I know that? You don't just announce to people, stand up, I want everyone to see what's going to happen to you. And, prediction, like word of wisdom, is working in your mind there. You know what's going to happen. You wouldn't do that and then make a fool of yourself. And you don't just do it to everyone you find. Stand forth. Stand upright. Arise. Let everyone in the synagogue see you. So he stands up. People are going to find out whether this Jesus has this miracle power or not. This is only about the 4th time he's healed in the synagogue. They should know by now. But it's a Sabbath day question, remember. He saith unto them. He sets them up this time. A lot of times they're trying to set him up with questions and controversies. But he sets them up. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days or to do evil? Well, it kind of boxes you in, which they try to do with him on occasion. You hate to say, well, it's the thing to do is to do evil. They know that's not right, but so they're not going to say that. But if they say it's right to do good, they know they can't say that because he said, all right, then let's just do a little healing today. So it's kind of like they don't have an answer. Is it lawful to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath day? Is it lawful to save life or to kill? Well, they couldn't say kill, but they couldn't say save. Look at the end of the verse. They held their peace. It's interesting that when Jesus gets them in a corner, they have no answer. When he gets them between a rock and a hard place. By the way, that's the first example here of the Herodians. Jesus puts them between a rock and a hard place. The second time, we go over to Matthew 22 in a moment. They put him between a rock and a hard place, and he always has an answer, though. Now, you remember that because it's rather notable that we've got 2 occasions of the Herodians here. And on one occasion, the first one, the earliest one, to the north in Galilee, he puts them between a rock and a hard place, knowing that they couldn't give an answer. They couldn't say that it's right to do good or to save, and at the same time they couldn't say that it's right to do evil or to kill. So they just hold their peace. Verse 5, and when he had looked round about on them with anger. If you look it up in the Greek, that's what you've got. Some people have a problem because Jesus said that if you have any anger in your heart, then you sin. It's the same as murder over in Matthew chapter 5. Well, you got to take Matthew 5 in context and Mark 3 in context and Ephesians 4 in context where Paul said, be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down on your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Be angry and sin not. There are types of anger that you can have, even anger at people that's not a malicious, personal type of hatred for them. Jesus said that type of anger. And he didn't say anger without a cause like you've got in the King James Version, Matthew 5. That type of anger, he said, is tantamount to murder. Because that type of anger, without certain external and internal restraints like law and the thought of a prison sentence and so forth and a guilty conscience, that type of anger without certain external and internal restraints would immediately lead to the committing of the act of anger, which is called murder. The only thing that keeps people back from manifesting their anger and murder, you know this, is certain restraints, whether external or internal. For the baser people out there, I guess more external. They don't want to go to prison forever. For people who are a little more sensitive, you couldn't live with yourself knowing you'd kill someone. So you just keep your anger, or you explode or whatever, but you don't let the gun explode. But Jesus has anger. It's a righteous anger. And he's going to tell us, well, Mark is going to tell us the basis or the reason for his anger. When he had looked round about on them after asking them this question, now is it right? I mean, they're not only are they wrong on their theology of the Sabbath day, that's bad enough, with all these bondages and restrictions and can'ts and don'ts, and they've just totally bound up God and his word and his people. Not only are they wrong on that, and that's bad enough, they're wrong on the healing question. You know these are divine sickness people here. They don't believe in divine healing. So when he had looked round about, none of them giving him any answer at all, and he knows where they are in total unbelief and doubt and skepticism, when he looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. Being grieved for the hardness of their hearts. He's not exactly personally angry with the individuals here. He's angry about the situation. I'm sure this is anger that's manifested towards Satan, that he has blinded the eyes of God's people. He's angry at the institution of his day called Judaism, which has robbed people of God's truth and God's law and God's message. I mean, there are a whole lot of things to be angry about. You would be justified to stand up in your typical church and look round about you with anger on the hardness of their hearts. Angry at the minister, angry at the people in one sense, that they had presumed to call themselves God's people, or presumed to judge you, the one who has the truth, when they can't answer a little simple question here. What should we do on the Sabbath day? Kill or give life? Heal or leave sick? What should we do on the Sabbath day? What should we do any day, really? Let me go back and read 5 again so we can get the thrust of what he's going to say. When he had looked round about on them with anger, being grieved with the hardness of their hearts, he saith unto the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. You know, you've seen people with withered arms or withered shoulder or withered hand or something. It's all drawn up and just, it's of no use at all. Sometimes, I guess most of the time, literally it is shortened. It's a short arm or short fingers or short hand. Completely immobile. You couldn't do anything with it. So when he says stand up, that's preparation for verse 5. Now stretch forth thine hand. Well, you can't stretch forth. You don't have anything to stretch forth. It's withered. Well, it's going to be a creative miracle here. The gift of the working of miracles. He doesn't need to be healed in any technical sense because he's not sick in any technical sense. But he needs a miracle because he's lacking something in his body. Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. You see, I can prove to you that the applications we're making here at the end of these studies in ITP concerning the religious institutions of our day are valid by this evidence and fact and point. Those churches read this very passage here and just say, isn't our Lord marvelous? He healed back in those days. They read the passage that we're reading. That never registers on them. They never think a thing about it, never question their own unbelief. They never go into their closet and think to themselves, where have we been so long? We're thinking of this like the Jews thought of their Old Testament. Well, wasn't that great when God our Father worked those miracles back in those days? Right. Back in those days. The applications are valid. The church of our day reads this passage and stretching forth your hand, I mean, that's a creative miracle. Not only could they not handle that, they couldn't handle even a simple type of healing of some small ailment. That'd be more than they can handle. And when you really get healing and everything down in your heart, then I think that you get this attitude of verse 5, or 5a rather. You look around about you with anger.
Amen.
Till you know that, you don't really know, the end time message until you are angry. Until you can mourn as well as be vehement with the institutional church and its dead state today. You don't really know God's heart. God's heart. God's heart. You remember Jesus is not only the one who looks with anger, but isn't he the one who weeps over Jerusalem and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that stonest and killest the prophets, how often would I have gathered you together as a hen of chicks under her wings, and ye would not." Not only is he angry, he weeps. You can have both of them. Jesus said, "Blessed are those that mourn." I think one thing that we're called to do in this day and hour is to mourn over rampant, unbridled, epidemic unbelief around us. When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on the earth? The question is very pointed and it's very applicable for whenever that time is that precedes the Lord's return to the earth. Will I find faith on the earth? We can look with sadness and sorrow and weeping and mourning round about us, but we can also look with anger as well. Well, Jesus says, "Stretch forth your hand," and he stretches it out, and it's made whole. It's restored like the other. Verse 6, what do we have? The Pharisees said, "Praise the Lord Almighty." Let's go tell the Herodians so they can praise Yahweh. Oh, let's write this up in Synagogue Weekly Bulletin now. Hallelujah. The days of Moses are being restored to us. Restorationism. No, they went forth straightway, took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they could kill him.
For the continued
They went forth straightway, took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they could kill him, how they could go out and destroy him. They should be saying, "Praise God for this miracle." I mean, Jesus, he criticizes them on other occasions, not exactly right here, but elsewhere, putting them in the place, what if you were the man with the withered hand? Can't you have mercy on people who have a need, who are sick and who need healing? The Pharisees are not only blind to scriptural truth, they have we've talked before about their gross lack of personal piety, they have no personal concern for anyone but themselves. They should be able to look on this man and just go through the motions in your own mind. What would it be like now if I had a hand like that? Now here's what I couldn't do. Here's how I would be incapacitated. Here's how miserable I would be. Oh, forget my theology that says no healing. This man needs healing here. Not only can they not approach it from a position like that, which isn't a completely scriptural one, but it'd be starting on the right path to lead you into the Word and say, now here's a promise for it. They can't do the latter that I've just described for you. Even if your theology is an anti-healing one, look around. There are some people that need some help. You should say, let's just get rid of our theology of divine sickness because there are people that need help and there's no way they're going to get help if God doesn't help them.
Amen.
Some people, most people, already have their minds so made up and are so cold and dead toward God and in spiritual areas that it makes them dead toward the whole message of compassion. And remember Jesus, and we'll see this in our studies in faith, he healed many times because of his compassion. Wasn't so much, it was undergirded by a doctrine of healing, but his compassion. People are made in God's image. They've been destroyed by the devil. They need to be restored.
Amen.
They need more than physical restoration, but they don't need less than that.
That's right.
And that's where the church of our day leaves them, less than that. They need more. They need some spiritual restoration, but they don't need anything less than physical restoration. The Pharisees and the Herodians, they take counsel together how they can kill this man now. Remember whenever, and this is just, whenever you read it for the first time, it almost takes your breath away. Over with Lazarus, remember whenever Lazarus was sick, some grievous illness he has, and no one can help him. Of course, the Pharisees don't have any hope. They don't have any faith. Faith, you have no doctrine of healing then, and Jesus goes ahead and lets him die and raise him from the dead. And remember what the Pharisees want to do? They want to kill him again.
Yeah.
Not only do they are they not rejoicing in his resurrection. Praise God. You know, maybe some woman here has a husband back. At least two sisters, Mary and Martha, have a brother back to them again. Let's praise God for this. I mean, just from a human point of view.
Yeah.
Not only are they not rejoicing over that, they said, let's get rid of him again. He's causing too many people to turn to Jesus. You read it over in John chapters 11 and 12. Chapter 11, resurrection. Chapter 12, you'll read that account. Can you believe the low-down dogs? They want to go out and kill old Lazarus again. He's already died once. They want to kill him for a second time. That's about where the church is today. If you ever get a healing, they want to take it away from you.
Amen.
They don't want you to have that. It makes them look bad.
That's right.
They want to take that healing away. And this was such a healing of such nature that it was life. They want to take life away from Lazarus and kill him again. Well, here, I don't know. I guess they want the man to have a withered hand again, but Mark doesn't comment on that. All he comments on is that the Pharisees go out and straightway, I mean, this wasn't something that took him any time. Immediately, Mark means they took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him. Well, we'll get back to our subject here tonight. How can we explain this? The Herodians and the Pharisees don't exactly agree on matters. The case involves a man with a withered arm or hand, and the question of work on the Sabbath day. It's a question of healing as well as their laws concerning the Sabbath. It's a religious question, in other words, not a political one, as the next case will be. The one we get to in Mark 12 or Matthew 22, also mentioned over in Luke 20, although the Herodian term doesn't appear, is a political one, not a religious one like we have here in Mark chapter 3. Now I'm not just talking, that's important here. The question here is a religious question. The Pharisees would be concerned about religious matters. The Herodians wouldn't be. Politically, the Herodians are, remember, pro-Antipas. They're pro-Herod. And in maybe some extended sense, they're pro-Rome insofar as the rule of Antipas kind of depends on Rome right now anyway for stability. Ultimately, I think they want the Romans to leave. But you don't want to have too many problems with the Romans in control, or the Romans will come and remove Antipas and put a Pontius Pilate up in Tiberias in Galilee, the headquarters in Galilee, and the Herodians certainly don't want that. The Pharisees themselves are anti-Hasmonean, they're anti-Antipas, and they're anti-Rome. They're just pro-Moses and the prophets, so they say. They're anti all this political business, though, the Hasmoneans and Herod Antipas and Roman rule. Religiously, the Herodians are nothing but worldlings. Remember, these are Jewish men, children of Abraham, people who have the law of Moses. Where do they stand religiously? Probably they're nothing but worldlings. They're kind of more like the Sadducees in that regard. And we've seen religiously where the Pharisees are. The Herodians, notice in verse 6, aren't even present. Well, obviously they aren't. They don't go to church. Now, the Pharisees go to church. They're going to be in synagogue. They're going to be at the service. The Herodians, notice that the Pharisees went forth. That means they went out of the synagogue and took counsel with the Herodians. They had to go find the Herodians. They don't go to church. They don't believe in all that religious stuff, or not much of it anyway. They're just into more politics, as it were. So the Herodians aren't even present at the incident. The Pharisees go find them to join the plot. May we explain this? Well, I think, like we've explained it earlier, a common cause unites even enemies.
Amen.
A common cause unites even enemies. The Pharisees and the Herodians are enemies in many regards. The Pharisees, friends, can't look very well upon the Herodians because the Pharisees want people to follow the laws of the scribes. The Pharisees are those people who live out what the scribes write down. And the Herodians don't want to have anything to do with religion, evidently. So the Pharisees could hardly think very well of them. And the Herodians, to turn that around, could hardly think very well of the Pharisees because the Pharisees are anti-Antipas. They're not in favor of any rule through Antipas by Rome or a rule by Antipas who has Idumean blood. That means Edomite blood, Esau blood in him. They're not in favor of that. They'd rather, someone who has more or less pure blood. If anyone's going to rule, let it be him or them rule over us. So what's so remarkable, and you find it down to this day, that whenever you have someone causing, or who has the potential, let's say, to cause as big an uproar as Jesus does, then you can get all types of people who are opposed to one another. You can get them together right away as soon as you see Jesus come on the scene. You get all types of enemies and foes, mutual enemies and foes together to lay down their swords and differences for a moment and unite over a common cause. So I can't help but see how strong the idea must have been in their mind of the potential that Jesus had to cause quite an uproar in Galilee. The Pharisees have joined with the Sadducees on other occasions. They can't hear because geography prevents that. Remember, the Sadducees live down in Jerusalem. They have something to do with the temple and the worship, so that's where they're stationed. If you ever see them elsewhere, they're traveling there. They don't live elsewhere. They stay down in Jerusalem. A synagogue in Capernaum up in Galilee, that's way up on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Hardly would you find Sadducees up there. So the Pharisees can't join with that earlier foe of theirs that they've joined with on other occasions to come against Jesus. Geography prevents that. So the nearest, strongest group evidently they can find, they just go out and pick anyone that they can find are the Herodians. I think both of them foresaw the disruption that Jesus' ministry could bring to Galilee and then through Galilee to all Israel. Now for the Herodians, their problem with that would be that as soon as some uproar begins, Rome steps in always, immediately. We see that throughout the book of Acts. As soon as some uproar starts, Rome steps in. Now, if an uproar starts in Galilee, Rome's going to step in. What are the probable conclusions of that? Herod Antipas will be removed, and a Gentile Roman leader like Pontius Pilate will be set in as leader. And the Herodians certainly don't want that. So they've got to keep Jesus out of the way, keep his ministry down, to keep any of this potential spread of revolt down. The Pharisees, of course, have other reasons. The Pharisees, they have other reasons, but they don't exactly want the Romans to come in either, because the Pharisees have some measure of independence here. At least they've still got their religious system, their land, their homeland, their nation, their temple, their priests. They have all of that. Now, Rome could just step in and say, now listen, it's a religious question that keeps causing problems here in Palestine, so we're going to stamp out religion here. No more Jewish religion. They do that in AD 70. No more Jewish religion, no more temple, no sacrifice, no laws, no prophets, no books to read from, no synagogues, no religion. The Pharisees wouldn't want that. And so they unite. And it's almost like what you see the American Civil Liberties Union do. They'll join anybody. They'll unite with people that the lawyers that work for that Antichrist, horrible, abominable, apostate, wicked, satanic organization. And they'd try to sue me for saying that, you see. The lawyers that work for them, even if they have a personal hatred of some of the causes. Man, if you take a right away from a lesbian, a black, a yellow, a white, a homosexual, a fundamentalist, a liberal, a Catholic, a Pentecostal, they don't care who you are. If you take a right away from someone, they'll sue you and they'll go to court over it. Even if they kind of stand against, take ourselves. If they hated anyone, it'd be a group like ours who doesn't like anybody else. Let's say you're taking rights away from everybody out there. If we ever got into trouble, they'd be more than willing to be our legal counsel. They'd do it free of charge. They'd join someone like us to fight what they would think is a common foe, and that is lack of liberty, discrimination, prejudice here in this country. ACLU is a good example of how you can get all types of people who just hate one another together if you've got some common enemy that you're trying to fight. I'm always just amazed how ACLU will fight anybody over anything if it comes to some type of right, political right, religious right, whatever. You find that immediately. And something else I could say, I could give you another example that's just come up in the last year, really. And by the way, it does concern rights and liberties and discrimination and all this stuff that we've been looking at some in Christian ethics with public education. And that is the joining together of even some, you'd expect other groups, but even some fundamentalist groups with Reverend Sun Moon and the Unification Church because of his persecution, they say, by the government. That he was singled out, he's a Korean, so his eyes don't look like ours, and he's got other views. He doesn't follow mainstream American religion. That's all right with us because mainstream views are wrong. His are equally wrong, by the way, but nothing wrong with not following mainstream religion in the United States, but he doesn't. And so, you know, he was thrown into prison for tax evasion. I don't know if he was guilty or not. Doesn't matter, though. Fundamentalist groups see that by attacking, or they see that by attacking Reverend Moon and the tax-exempt status of his group, that the United States government is eventually going to come and kind of sneak around through the back door and maybe revoke tax-exempt status of all religious groups. So what, of course, they're wanting to do is, hey, listen, as far as this issue is concerned, Reverend Moon's a brother of ours. And even fundamentalist churches. Now, you'd expect the liberals to support him, but fundamentalists. I could even name some. I won't, but I could name some who, on principle and in theology, would say that Moon's a heretic. When it comes to, they say, well, we lay down religious differences here because this doesn't have anything to do with religion. This is a political matter here, but you can't separate the two, though. Can you imagine going to testify on Moon's behalf? I don't care, what it has to do with testifying on Moon's behalf. His church has been used. There are meeting places and things like that for, every event under the sun. But so has Robert Schuller's big old cathedral out there, too. They've had all types of secular meetings in there. And he's on the carpet now with IRS because, tax-exempt status when you can just have, anything from AA to sumo wrestling in there. All types of secular concerts. There's no preaching. They're just, using their building for that. But they said, hey, wait a minute. You can't keep this tax-exempt status when a lot of this doesn't have any religious connotations at all. Well, of course, Moon got into problems with that. But what I'm saying is, it's easy to explain how you're going to get two foes together like the Pharisees and the Herodians. They got different reasons for wanting Jesus to be put out, snuffed out, killed literally here. They got different goals, but they can still unite because they want him out, and that's the end. Well, if you turn over to Matthew 22, we'll come to our other occasion where they're mentioned. Matthew 22, verses 15 to 22. And it's also seen in Mark 12, and it's also seen over in Luke, chapter 20, verses 19 to 26. Now, the reason I didn't give you Luke's account earlier is because he doesn't use the term Herodians. We don't know who the Pharisees are joining up with, but Matthew and Mark tell us who, the Herodians. Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 through 22, and this is a tribute question. Now, I don't know if you can write all this down quickly enough. I don't want to spend all the time, but let me just rehearse this. If you would read all three of those accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then here's how you could kind of interweave the details. If we put all the accounts together, I think this is a picture that we would have. First of all, Jesus had silenced, and you may not be able to write this, but you can at least listen. Jesus had silenced the Jewish leaders by refusing to answer their question about authority. They've asked him that question, by whose authority? And he gives them a little answer. And the answer is another question. If you'll answer my question, I'll answer yours. And remember what his question was? Well, authority of John the Baptist. Where did he get his authority? Of man or from God? Well, they knew they couldn't answer that. You see this all the time. Jesus putting them in a box or them thinking that they're putting him in one, putting him in a corner. John's authority, did it come from above or from below? Well, they thought to themselves, if we say that he got his authority from men, that his baptism was of men, then the people will probably stone us because of the obvious implications. And then if we say from God, well, we can't say from God because we rejected his baptism. Luke 7, I think verse 30, verse 29 and 30. So you see, they're kind of between a rock and a hard place. They can't give an answer. So he said, neither will I answer you. By what authority I do these things. So he silenced them concerning the question about authority by telling them this little episode I just given to you, and he embarrassed them through doing that. The Pharisees become angry with him, and they seek plans to trap him in his talk. Matthew 22:15. Now, they concoct this whole plan here, and purposely, it's premeditated to trap him in his talk. The entire Sanhedrin becomes involved. The whole Sanhedrin's involved in this. Mark 11:27 with Mark 12:12 to 13, and Luke 20 and verse 19. So the council sends a message to the Herodians and to the Pharisees. Now the Herodians happen to be visiting down in Jerusalem at this time. This is the last week of Jesus' ministry because it's Passover time. So the Herodians are down there visiting. The Sanhedrin knows that. Sanhedrin sends a message to the Herodians and to the Pharisees to do something about Jesus. And the Pharisees then actually send out some of their disciples, quote unquote, or sympathizers. They're called disciples in Matthew 22:16, as spies to catch Jesus in his words. And we're told that they were sent out in Luke 20 and verse 20, pretending to be good, honestly seeking men. But their desire actually is to have him arrested and turned over to Pilate, the Roman governor. Okay, that's the background. Now, with that as the background, let's just read Matthew's account. We don't want to take the time to read all the others. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. And they sent out unto him their disciples, people who sympathize with them, and the Herodians. Only other time we find them now in the Gospels. Saying, Teacher, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. Now that's all just a pious, dishonest flattery that they're giving. They don't really believe any of that he teaches the way of truth, and they would have followed him and been his disciples, and not the disciples of the Pharisees. So that's all a lot of pious nonsense. Called buttering someone up. That's what they're doing. But, of course, God, Jesus Christ, he's too wise for that. Tell us, therefore, this is they're posing it as an innocent question like, oh, we know that you're the wise one. They call him teacher, rabbi. You have all the knowledge. You teach the way of God in truth. You don't care about people, their opinions. You just stay narrow with the truth. So we've got a deep question that we're concerned about here. We don't know about paying tribute here. Is it lawful to pay tribute unto Caesar or not? Notice they don't just say, we don't know what to do. They cast the question in a yes or no type framework. You have to get a yes or no answer. They didn't want to let him give them a little lecture about, whatever. They couldn't catch him. They're trying to entangle him, remember, verse 15 in his words. Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? They asked the question pointedly in this way to elicit either a yes or no answer. They know that either way Jesus goes, he's going to be in trouble. Now, here's what I mean by that. They put him between a rock and a hard place. What if he says, yes, it is lawful to give tribute unto Caesar? Well, now that's going to alienate a good portion of the Jewish people who hate having to pay that tax. So that's where he's going to put himself if he says yes. So what if he said no, it's not lawful? Well, if he says no, which is probably what they're hoping, well, I guess they're hoping for either answer. Either one will do them just fine. Yes, the answer is going to alienate him from a good section of the population. A lot of the Jews don't want to pay that tax. If he says no, it's unlawful, it's wrong to pay tribute to Caesar, well, you know what they'll do. They will immediately report him to the Roman leader Pontius Pilate for treason and insurrection. That here is one of these latent, fanatical Jewish revolutionaries who is attempting to overthrow the Roman government. So they would quickly report him for treason and insurrection. So what does he say? Well, remember, on the occasions where he puts them in this position, they have no answer. They held their peace, remember, Mark 3. But when Jesus perceived their wickedness, now just let it be said that way. Anytime some religious person tries to get you in a corner over a question and try to make a fool of your beliefs, God calls that wickedness. When you've got the truth, they're trying to force you to some illogical conclusion or extreme, God calls that wickedness. He said, "Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money." And they brought unto him a piece. And he saith unto them, "Whose is this image and superscription?" They say unto him, "Caesar's." In other words, the Lord's brilliance here is in pointing toward the coin. He lets the coin give the answer. He's not going to give an answer. He knows that he can't say yes, and he can't say no. He'd be in trouble either answer that he gave. So he lets the coin do the talking. And really he lets them answer it, because he asks them a question. Always in their questioning him, he has questions for them. Always the Lord has questions for them. I mean, always. We see it again later, like in this same chapter, in chapter 22. He's put the Sadducees to silence, remember, about the question of the resurrection. He said, "You do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God." And as we saw in one of the other accounts, he asked him, "Haven't you read your Bible?" He asked him a question, "Haven't you read?" And the Pharisees, when they heard he had put the Sadducees to silence, up in verse 34, they asked him this question about what's the greatest commandment. He gives them an answer, and then look in verse 41. When the Pharisees were, while they were still there, Jesus asked them a question. "What do you think of Christ? Whose son is he? What do you think of him?" And of course they say David's son, and we see they got into trouble. They put themselves in a corner by answering that question. It's always question and answer, question and answer. So Jesus asks a question to their question and forces them to give their own answer. "Whose image is this in superscription?" They say unto him, "Caesar's." So he said, there's your answer. Whatever belongs to Caesar, give to Caesar. But then, so he wouldn't alienate those Jews who were kind of anti-politics or anti-Roman government, kind of like pro the Commonwealth of Israel and pro the nationhood of Israel. So he won't alienate them. He goes on to say, that's not all. He said, whatever's Caesar's, give to Caesar's. And whatever's God's, give to God. That way he was able to pacify both sides in one regard. Didn't pacify all of them. I mean, he's not a jack of all trades giving any answer to anyone, giving them whatever they're expecting him to say. But he's able to pacify both groups. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. In other words, if that coin there has Caesar's picture on it, I guess that belongs to him then. It'd be stealing to take what belongs to Caesar and keep for yourself. If it's got his picture on it, I mean, if you find something that has someone's name on it, you return it to him. This coin has Caesar's image and superscription on it, well, go give it back to him then. See, and he's got them in a corner now. But then he doesn't stop with that. Then he says, and whatever's God's, gives to him. In other words, he's not going to allow them to put him in the corner with this first phrase that he gives to them, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and have them think that they can be responsible only to Caesar, like some of the politically minded ones would want to be, and not be responsible to God. He said, God also has some obligations on your life. Whatever those are, he doesn't detail them here. They are detailed elsewhere in his teaching. But whatever they are, render unto him. And you know, the conclusion to this whole thing, I think, is down in the last verse of this chapter in verse 46. We can bring our study of the Herodians to a conclusion here. That's really all you can say about them. That's the only place they appear, only two places they appear. But after we've gone through these lengthy chapters from 19 through 22, and especially in 22, question after question here, we read in verse 46, and no man was able to answer him a word, neither durst, I like that good word durst there. It means dared. You know, you just, whenever you hit your head against a block wall, often enough, you get the point.
Amen.
You don't want to be embarrassed anymore. You start questioning your own sanity or your own intellectual capability. And you think, I just knew he had something that was going to get him in a corner here. We had it planned out in advance. Notice it's the Spirit that comes on Jesus all the time. He doesn't plan his answers out. They're planning their schemes and strategy. They take counsel together. You got to picture all of the machinations and the workings there, like, what do you think would be the best question? They take answers from the Sanhedrin, and they finally narrow it down. Here's the most difficult thing we could think of. They put a lot of work into that, and they come before him, and he just has this brilliant answer.
Hallelujah.
So, you get tired of hitting your head against that block wall anymore. So no man was able to answer him a word, neither dared any man from that day forth to ask him any more questions. That's why Matthew, has this right here, because you really don't. Well, you have his trial, which is a different situation, but no more religious discussions. You can go ahead and read the rest of Matthew's gospel. That's the end of them. They've been going on for a long time now. And they really heated up here in the last week in Jerusalem. But that's really a verse that's stuck in I hate to use the word crawl, so I'll say my spirit, my mind, my experience for a long time since I first saw it. No man was able to answer him a word, neither durst any man from that day forth ask him any more questions. Say, well, I haven't quite gotten to that point yet. Well, maybe it's just because the Pharisees of Jesus' day were a little smarter than some religious people today. Because you can get them in a corner and they just keep on talking anyway. Back in the good old days, people saw when they were wrong. In our age of pluralism, I don't think people even know that there is such a thing as wrong.
Right.
It's just everyone is right.
Amen.
And you just will talk and get them in a corner they can't get out of, and they'll say, well, yeah, it doesn't really matter one way or the other, and they just go right on anyway. Back in the good old days, whenever people knew how to practice, good reasoning and argumentation and logic, they knew when they were had. When you were in checkmate, you knew it. But you see what the spirit of pluralism has done to our age. There's no such thing as checkmate anymore. You can't even get people there. I mean, it would just take some supernatural, incredibly divine wisdom. And you have a lot from the Bible, but even that won't be enough to really get someone in a corner where they just say, I lay down my guns. There's nothing else I can say to you. On a few occasions, I think we are blessed with that, but and maybe it'll increase, but in most of the world it'll decrease because of the spirit of pluralism. I have had a few occasions where I've had people say, well, there's nothing else I can say. But if you're arguing scripturally and by the Spirit, that's always the conclusion. They may go ahead and keep on talking. But a snake, once its head's cut off, it can wiggle for a while. They may keep on talking, but it's all over with. There's nothing they can say. And that serpent parallel is not by accident. Their arguments come from the old serpent, that old dragon, the devil, the serpent, the snake. You can catch a bullfrog and skin him and cut his legs off and throw him in a bowl of water in the refrigerator. You want to have him for breakfast tomorrow morning, his legs, and put a little salt on his legs. They'll just kick and throw water, and you'll open the refrigerator, and that water will be everywhere in there. I've had that happen countless times with bullfrogs, killing bullfrogs and eating frog legs. They'll just kick, but that frog's dead. The argument's over with. He may have put up a fight for a while with that gun or that gig of yours going after him, and, he's going to outsmart you. And, whenever we used to gig for frogs, you had to be real quiet and still. You wear the headlamp so you don't have to have a flashlight in your hand. You got two hands for the gig, and you come on them, and you make a noise, and they're gone. They can't see. They're blind with the light. And you make a noise, they're gone, so they got the last word there. Well, then they'll resurface. Frogs aren't fish. They're like a whale. They're going to have to come up to breathe. They'll come back up and get them on the bank again and go after them again. Whenever you get them, you've gigged them, their head is cut off, they're skinned, their legs have been severed from their body. You couldn't ask for any more death than death. They're dead. But they may still wiggle for a while. They may move for a while. So you may not have someone admit to you, that's it. You just completely overran me with your arguments. You may not have them admit that to you, but if you use the Word of God, you'll get them into that position sooner or later. If you go far enough, you'll get them there. And the rest of it's just the smoke that occurs after you put a fire out.